Okay, folks, you should have done a little bit of note taking on Roanoke and Jamestown. So follow in your notes as you listen to this. Pause it when you need to and write down anything else that you need to put down as important. I'm going to go fast, so you really need to keep up. So Spain was here and they were after gold in the Americas. They settled South America, Central America, and what would be parts of Southwest North America, like where Arizona is and whatnot. They were looking for gold, period. They didn't care who they had to kill or make slaves out of to get gold. The Spanish were after gold. We talked about the French the other day. The French were after furs, and they lived in our area of North America and used the rivers as highways and the Great Lakes as highways to send their furs to New Orleans to load up on ships and send back to Europe to make a profit. They got along very well with the Native Americans, so much that the French fur trappers often married Native American women. So we're going to talk about the English. England, of course, wants to get in on the game also. They're going to send people over. In 1585, they end up in North Carolina at a place called Roanoke. They thought that they could find gold and weren't worried about food. They spent so much time looking for gold that they didn't plant enough food, ended up staying there just a few months, loaded up and went back to England. 2 years later, in 1587, John White sent another group, this time with men, women, and children, to Roanoke, and they were going to take some food with them. However, after they ran out of supplies again, John White is going to go back to England. That's where our story is going to pick up. So, Sir Walter Raleigh, who was one of the Queen's favorites, all right, like I said, in 1585, he's going to go ahead and organize a voyage to Roanoke, North Carolina. They take 7 ships and all men. They were too busy looking for gold and they ran out of food. They also did have trouble with the Native Americans when it came to hostilities. They were shooting at each other and didn't like each other very much. So needless to say, the Native Americans were happy when the white guys left. They packed up and went back, all right? That's not going to be the end, however. Like I told you, in 1587, 2 years later, there's going to be a second attempt at Roanoke. All right. And this time, like I told you, John White and 117 others are going to go over. They're going to take men, women, and children and hope that they can make a colony. Their supplies are going to run low. John White's going to leave for England, promises everybody that he'll be back within a few months. Doesn't return for 3 years because when he gets back home to England, England and Spain were at war and he wasn't allowed to leave. 3 years later, he comes back to Roanoke, North Carolina, and finds absolutely no one. The only thing that the men found was this creepy word inscribed on a tree, Croatoan. Now, the Croatoans were a group of Native Americans that lived a few miles away. So one would think that something happened in the village and they went with the Croatoans. So John White and his men went to the Croatoans and asked if they had seen the settlers, and they didn't see anyone. This is a mystery even today in the 2000s. All right, no one still to this day knows what happened to the people at Roanoke. So they call it the Lost Colony. If you look at the map here, you can see what I'm talking about. Now, they were just a little bit south of Jamestown, all right, of where Jamestown's going to be. So 1585, Roanoke was a fail. 1587, it was an epic fail. Everybody disappeared. England's not going to try making another colony over here until 1607. And that's going to be Jamestown. So as soon as the men came over and settled in Jamestown, they decided that the best thing that they needed was a government. They started to argue over who was going to run the show. And as it says in the notes, they were more interested in gold than anything else. All right, but they eventually work it out. They do set up a government and they start to build a village and a fort to protect themselves from Native Americans. Now, if you look on this map, you can see that today this is what Jamestown looks like. And if you go to the expedition at some point that I'll have for you, I'll walk you through and show you some of the ruins of Jamestown. But today, it's still an active archaeological dig. You can see that the James River has come up a lot, and you can see the triangle outline of the original fort at Jamestown. Problem was, they built it on a swamp, and they didn't know it at the time, but whenever it rained in the spring, the whole place would flood. This is what Jamestown would look like after it started to thrive. Native Americans were close. You could see the watchtower in the upper right-hand corner. You could see the fort down at the bottom, that anytime there were Native American attacks, the people would go inside the fort for protection. But they did settle on the James River, which was very swampy at the time. All right, today, if you go to Jamestown, this is pretty much all you see. I've been there. It's really cool because you're not just learning about it in a classroom, you're actually walking around the old ruins of what was Jamestown, built in 1607. Here's one of the foundations of the home. These are the original bricks. This is where people actually live today. It's a historical landmark. You can go and walk around. It's in Virginia, not too far from where we live. Again, this is part of where the original fort was. There's pathways today. It doesn't look like much, all right? But back then, at first, it was very slow going until the Native Americans got on their side and sort of hooked them up with how to grow tobacco, send it over to Europe, and make a profit. This is one of 4 or 5 churches that were built at Jamestown, and the first 3 were burned down by Native Americans. So this is what you need to know. They settled in 1607 and barely made it through the next 2 years, but during the winter of 1609, it was called the Starving Time. They call it the Starving Time because more than half of the people at Jamestown starved to death. They ran out of food. They were having problems with Native Americans. They didn't meet up with Pocahontas yet. The Puritans were giving them problems, and the settlers were giving them problems back. We now know, because of archaeological digs going on at Jamestown, that the settlers did eat themselves. They committed cannibalism. They would eat people who were already dead. That's how desperate they were for food. They have found skulls recently in the past 3 or 4 years that have knife marks through them, indicating that yes, someone was purposely cutting the meat and the skin off of the people and then cooking them. Sometimes you just have to do what you need to do in order to survive, I guess. 140 people were dead just in that winter time, just in 1609. Now, the next spring is when John Rolfe meets up with Pocahontas, gets along with the Puritans. There's a short peace, and saves Jamestown because the Native Americans showed them how to grow tobacco. You know, the things that cigarettes are filled with, tobacco, you know, that causes cancer today. If you think about it, Jamestown would not have worked if they didn't know how to grow tobacco and then take it back to England and sell it for a huge profit. That made Jamestown grow. More people came to Virginia, and that became the first successful established colony in the Americas. Now, John Smith, we talked about him already. All right, he's going to end up trading with the Native Americans. This is the guy that ended up sort of causing some of the problems with Native Americans until John Rolfe, of course, would marry Pocahontas. And you've probably seen that movie before. Once again, yeah, we look at Pocahontas as this incredibly important person in American history that saved the people at Jamestown because she stopped the fighting and showed them how to grow tobacco. She marries John Rolfe, and Disney, of course, made this cute little movie about it. It's actually incorrect. Pocahontas was the 14th daughter of the Powhatan leader, and she was pretty much a bratty little kid whenever she first met the English. She marries John Rolfe when she's approximately 14, 15 years old. I know that's kind of gross, but that's just how it was. Eventually settles all the arguments between the British and the Native Americans, and eventually goes back to England and dies in her 20s. All right, she does go back to England and dies in her 20s. She was sort of like a celebrity in England when she went back there. This is what tobacco looks like. If you've ever driven through Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, you've seen these big, giant, leafy plants. This is tobacco. They would get it, they would grow it, they would harvest it. They would dry it out by hanging it at the very tops of the ceilings inside their huts in the summertime because heat rises and would dry out the leaves. Then they would ship it over to England, get paid for it, and the colony would thrive. So once again, this is what tobacco looks like. Isn't it ironic the thing that kills you today was the thing that saved Jamestown? So yay! Jamestown is saved. All right, in 1620, we need to talk about this. The Mayflower. Everybody thinks that the Mayflower was the only ship that the Pilgrims had. That is untrue. In 1620, they're going to land here in Massachusetts. Now, if you want to look at the ship itself, it wasn't that big, children. It was only as big as my classroom and the classroom next door put together. That was about 90 feet. A tiny little ship, only 24 feet wide. This room is over 30 feet wide. So the ship would fit in between 2 classrooms easily here in the middle school. All right. There was a second ship called the Speedwell. They left also with the Mayflower, with Pilgrims and investors on board, but they had a cracked main beam and had to turn around because the ship would have sunk in the Atlantic. So most people think it was just the Mayflower that left with the Pilgrims, when in all actuality there were 2 ships. All right. On the voyage, it's kind of amazing that only 2 people died. All right, one was a doctor's apprentice, and one was one crew member who fell overboard. He survived, but later on, another would fall overboard and he would die. Only 35 to 45 people out of the 102 were pilgrims. So wait a minute, who the heck were the other people? Those were people who were investors who got their own money and wanted to put money into the establishment of a new colony, and if the colony made money, they would get paid big time. That's what an investor does. An investor uses their own money to hopefully make a profit. So only 30 or 40 of the men, women, and children were pilgrims. The other people were crew members and investors who were only out there to make some money. All right. The reason why they left England in the first place, if you remember, after the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther, after he did his thing, all right, we talked about the other day, England became the Anglican Church, also known as the Church of England. And if you remember, they got rid of the Pope. Well, these folks, separatists, wanted to separate themselves from the Church of England, but that was illegal. So they were tired of being arrested and abused in England, so they actually moved to Holland, the Netherlands, the Dutch. Lived there for about 10 years until they got kicked out of there also. That's when Jamestown was successful, and they decided to go ahead and try to go to Virginia, where Jamestown was. They got blown off course, however, and ended up in mid-November in Massachusetts. Now, if you know what the weather is like here in the Pittsburgh area in November, go north about 600 miles to the Boston area, Massachusetts. It gets incredibly cold and snowy in November. That's what they ended up sort of landing on. All right, before they got off the ship, they famously made something called the Mayflower Compact. All right, you could see famous people like Miles Standish. 41 men created this agreement, and it was a set of laws that everybody in the colony had to follow. While they were there in Plymouth, Massachusetts, they ended up making friends with Squanto and Samoset. Squanto, who was captured by the English about 10 years before this, actually spoke English. So imagine how freaked out they were whenever all of a sudden, here comes a Native American, but he speaks the same language as they do. All right, they had to be incredibly confused. As I said before, Squanto was captured by the English. Samoset was kind of his boss. He was one of the higher up men in the Native American group that are going to help the Pilgrims. Squanto, the guy on your right, was an interpreter. He spoke English and the Native American languages. The first Thanksgiving supposedly took place, all right, between the Pilgrims and the Native Americans. There's a lot of false things in here, all right. They did not have tablecloths. They did not have big silver platters. They didn't even have a table, from what we understand here at Plymouth. All right, think about it. These people came over just a couple of years before this, or a year before this, and do you think they bothered packing tablecloths or the nice silver platters and the nice plates and silverware? Absolutely not. So the first Thanksgiving, which lasted 3 days, is when the Native Americans showed up with about 50 people on a hunting party. The Pilgrims were a little bit scared, and they invited them to go ahead and not kill them and share some food. So they sat around on the ground. The Native Americans went out, killed a few deer, some eel, and some other native creatures, and they ate together for 3 days. I'm sure the Pilgrims were wondering when they were going to leave, but eventually they do after 3 days. So there's a lot of falsehoods in this first Thanksgiving. All right, so once again, there's a lot of things that are very, very false about the first Thanksgiving. They probably did not even have the type of clothing that you see hanging on walls around Thanksgiving in schools and stuff like that. They did not have buckles on their hats. They did not have buckles on their shoes. That wouldn't be in style for years. And they definitely didn't have all this nice silverware that they brought over from Holland with them. Absolutely not. This is what it probably would have looked like. All right, Native Americans sitting on the ground. They may have had a makeshift table, but this is what it was like. They would pass bowls of food around, and people would reach in and grab a little bit to eat, and that was the first quote-unquote Thanksgiving. It was more of a scary thing for the Pilgrims that all of a sudden these Native Americans came rolling out of the woods with war paint on. So they decided to go ahead and share their food with them. All right, don't write any of this, just pay attention. like we said, after that harvest, they didn't celebrate the next quote unquote Thanksgiving the next year, any year thereafter. It wasn't until Abraham Lincoln in the 1860s made it a national holiday, and it didn't become the last Thursday of November like it is today until 1939 when Franklin Roosevelt made it the last Thursday of November. And that's when we celebrate it today by eating tons of food, getting stuffed, and then watching football and falling asleep. All right, there were some myths. They didn't always wear black. The buckles would not be in style for some time. All right, only 20 men on both sides attended. They may have had turkeys, but it was more of native foods that were there. Seafood, squirrels, ducks. The one that always kind of grosses me out is eel. Yeah, eel, which are like snakes that live in the water. Yeah, that's what they would have eaten, guys, girls. All right. Lasted only 1 to 3 days. All right. I know I have here that it lasted 1 day, but it was more like 3. All right. The Native Americans just wouldn't leave. All right. They just wouldn't leave. So if you're taking any notes on this, this is actually wrong, and I'm correcting it right now. Yeah, the Indians were not invited as friends, as I told you before. They just rolled up on the Pilgrims and said, hey, got anything to eat? And that was the first Thanksgiving. Some other myths. That second picture was the most accurate, but they probably didn't have shirts on. Why? Or they probably did have shirts. Why? Because it's the middle of November and it's cold. All right. Native Americans aren't dumb. They're not walking around half naked. So of course they were probably wearing something. All right. They didn't have plates and utensils and things like that. They did have something called a blunderbuss, which is a gun that sort of looks like a trumpet. All right. That's the one that kind of looks like a trumpet. I'm trying to draw it here with my fingers. And it's not the easiest thing in the world to do, but it's not too bad, huh? All right, that's the one that kind of looks like this that you see in cartoons, and it makes a big loud noise, and it shoots almost like little BBs out of it. That's a blunderbuss. All right, now they did actually have one of those, but it wasn't really used for shooting anyone and killing anybody. It was just loud and scared the crap out of people. All right, some of the other things not there. No, they didn't have ham. They didn't have sweet potatoes or yams. These hadn't even been introduced to New England yet. Some people say popcorn. Probably not. All right, probably not. Cranberry sauce. My wife makes a mean cranberry sauce, but yeah, cranberries were there, but yeah, not the type of cranberry sauce that you see today. They probably just ate the cranberries. And of course, I know this one's just going to make you just cry. Pumpkin pie. They probably did make kind of like a pudding out of the guts of the pumpkin, like whenever you carve one and you're pulling all that slop out of there. But it wasn't like a pumpkin pie like we eat today and put tons of Ready Whip on the top at Thanksgiving. So it wasn't anything like that. All right, this is what they probably would have looked like. Notice no buckles. All right, no buckles here, no buckles on the hat. And they were probably dirty old clothes. They only had 1, maybe 2 changes of clothes back then. And no, they did not bathe regularly. Everybody stunk. All right, Puritans. The Puritans follow the Pilgrims 10 years later in 1630. They end up in Massachusetts, not too far from Plymouth, but in Massachusetts Bay. Now, they wanted to purify the religion. That's where the word Puritans comes from. And again, you learned this last year in 7th grade. I'm just going over it again. They left because they wanted to get away from the Church of England also. They wanted to practice their own religion freely. So they ended up in Massachusetts, all right, not too far from where the Pilgrims ended up. Thing is, with the Puritans, God was first. You weren't allowed to have fun or do any fun things, especially on the Sabbath day, which was Sunday. They believed in something called predestination, that God had a plan for you and you needed to go ahead and obey his rule for your entire life and live out your predestination or his plan for you. All right. They were very pure. If you did anything wrong and it didn't require capital punishment, which was hanging you, they put you in the stockade or the rack. Your head would go in the big hole in the middle, your hands, of course, here on the side, and whatever your punishment was, you may be in there for just a few hours or for multiple days. People in the citizenry, people in the town could come up and throw things at you and insult you and call you a sinner right to your face and flick boogers at you and all that nasty stuff. All right. Yes, capital laws. Mr. Canavy told you this last year because some of you have already asked me. If you zoom in, I'm not going to spend time on this, but if you pause this and zoom in and look at some of the rules that the Puritans had, all right, this will get you killed. These are capital laws. If you break any of these capital laws, you could be put to death. You could be put to death. If a man have a stubborn or rebellious son, 15 years, you could be put to death if you did something wrong because you're not being a good parent. So you can pause this and zoom in and look at some of these laws yourselves. All right, Salem witch trials. Let's just get right to the point because I know that you talked about it with Mr. Canavy and Mr. Carter last year. The Salem witch trials happened in Salem, Massachusetts. All in all, over 90 people were arrested. Some girls who may have been bored or who may have been sick decided to start pointing fingers at people and calling people witches. Some historians think that they were serious. Some people think that they were put under a voodoo spell by Tituba, all right, one of the servants. But they accused people of witchcraft. And back then, the Puritans were terrified of witches. They actually believed in witchcraft. And all it took was someone pointing another person out, saying, I saw so-and-so riding through the air on a broom last night, and you would be accused of witchcraft. And they were subject to witch tests. I'm sure that you learned that last year. I'm just reviewing witch tests. They would do things like put very heavy boulders on old men's chests. If he was able to push the boulder off, then yes, he was a witch, and then he was condemned to death. If the boulder crushed him, oh wow, he wasn't a witch anyhow. So yes, they did have strange punishments like this. You can Google them if you don't remember them from last year. Again, just a review. But over 90 people were arrested and dozens of people were killed, probably innocently, because they were guilty first until proven innocent. Today, it's supposed to be innocent until proven guilty.